All right, so let's get started. Music recommendation for today, a band called State Champs is actually headlining a 4-band pop punk showcase at the big venue, new venue Roadrunner down in Allston near Boston. So if you're into pop punk, there's gonna be a lot of good bands playing there, and it's something to check out. I think it's December 9th. Okay, today we're going to continue our discussion of Chapter 20 and tax efficiency. Let's remind ourselves of the key formula that drives this discussion, which is the deadweight loss from taxation from a tax is equal to minus a half times the product of supply and demand elasticities over the difference between supply and demand elasticities times cost squared times Q over P. Okay, so remember that basically as you think about what caused the deadweight loss from taxation, it's driven by both elasticities. More elastic factors are more inefficiently taxed because they react to avoid the taxes, which was caused inefficiency. Remember, we start from the optimal point. So anything that, absent other market failures, anything people do to avoid taxes is inefficient. Okay, so more elastic factors cause more inefficiencies, and the inefficiency grows with the square of the tax rate because you're getting farther and farther from the optimum. So that wedge, the trade you're losing, are more valuable as you get farther and farther from the optimum. So the marginal deadweight loss of taxation rises with the rate of taxation. Okay, and based on that formula, we showed, for example, things that progressive taxes are more inefficient than proportional taxes because you have to put more of the revenue raising on a smaller base of people, which means you need a higher tax rate. And likewise, we talked about the fact we want to smooth tax rates over time. We don't want to have a situation where we have a 20% tax rate one year and a 1% tax rate the next year, but rather you'd like to have sort of 1% over 20 years. Because once again, the deadweight loss, not 1% tax, is much, much smaller than the deadweight loss from incrementally increasing it. Okay, so we talked about those general lessons for tax policy. Now, of course, all of that is in a world where people understand how taxes work. There's actually just a sort of side note of an application in the book. There's a lot of evidence that people don't really understand how taxes work. So for example, there's a child tax credit you get, which is a flat amount. It ends when your kids turn 17. It's fairly predictable that your child's going to turn 17. And yet people's labor supply changes dramatically when the kids turn 17 and the child credit stops coming. Even though that's not a change in the marginal rate because it's a credit. And even though it's a predictable event, people don't seem to be forward-looking enough, understand taxes enough to actually not respond to the actual ending of the child tax credit. There's evidence even that if you ask people what taxes are like, and you ask people just say to them, well, will you draw a typical tax schedule? People tend to take two mistakes. First of all, they tend to think taxes are much less progressive than they are. And they tend to think average tax rates equal marginal tax rates. That is, they tend to sort of forget the difference between average and marginal tax rates. They think basically a proportional tax system that's fairly flat. That's sort of people's perceptions. Now, as one article points out, if people really think that the tax system is not as progressive as it actually is, and that there's just sort of a proportional tax system, that means the deadweight loss from progressive system might not be that large. In other words, if people don't understand the system's progressive, then you won't have that big a deadweight loss from progressive tax systems. So in some sense, while theory would say the true tax schedule should dictate the deadweight loss, in practice, it's actually how people react to it, which is really the perceived tax system. So we have to keep that in mind as well as we think about interpreting the deadweight loss from taxation in reality. Okay, so that's where I wanted to go on sort of the basic theory of tax efficiency. Today, we're going to apply that theory to three different things. The first is optimal commodity taxation. And here we'll talk about one of the most interesting characters in economic history, Frank Ramsey. Frank Ramsey wrote probably three of the most important articles in economic history before age 28 and then died in a car crash. Sort of the James Dean of economists, if you follow movie history. Okay, and one of those articles, one of them became economic growth theory. You've heard of that. and one became the model of optimal taxation. In particular, Ramsey sort of laid out how we should think about taking the tools of tax efficiency theory and applying it to taxing goods. Now, in Ramsey's day, back in the beginning of the 20th century, much of taxation was raised by taxing goods, not income. Today, most revenue in developed countries is raised by taxing income, and we'll come back to income taxation later. But it's still true in much of the world that most of the revenue is raised by taxing goods. And in even European countries, there's a large VAT, much of the revenue is raised by taxing goods. So it's useful to think about, if you have a tax system where you raise taxes on goods, what is the right way to set the tax rates across those different goods? So imagine a tax system, which isn't just like a 6% sales tax, but where literally you have a specific tax on every single good. And imagine you have a revenue requirement to meet. Ramsey posed a fairly simple problem, which is, what is the way to raise that revenue with the lowest amount of distortion? Question?
It's like tax on consumption.
Yes. So basically, what is the way to raise that revenue? Well, or tax on the sale of the good. Either way, it doesn't matter because we assume per side of the market's irrelevant. But the point is, it's like a specific, it's like this is going to be the tax on Fruit Loops, the tax on apple cinnamon Cheerios, the tax on Teslas, the tax on whatever. You're going to tax every specific good. It's going to have its own tax rate. Okay. So think of it being I goods, you know, all the goods in society, each one's going to have its own tax rate. How should you set those tax rates to minimize the deadweight loss to reach a certain level of revenue? Or in other words, how do you, as it's often said, how do you pluck the feathers from the goose with the least squawking? Okay, it's the sort of associated sort of contemporary saying back when people pluck geese for a living, I guess. So basically, essentially, what Ramsey did, and we can sort of write out in the appendix the problem he solves. In the appendix, we talk about the problem he solved. He basically said, look, you have N goods that you can tax. So your goal is to minimize the deadweight loss of taxing good 1, plus the deadweight loss of taxing good 2, plus the deadweight loss from taxing good 3, all the way to the deadweight loss from taxing good N, subject to the revenues you raise from taxing good 1, plus the revenues you raise from taxing good 2, plus the revenues raised from taxing good 3, all the way to the revenues raised from taxing good N, equals some revenue requirement R bar. That's the problem he laid out. Okay. And he wrote out the Lagrangian for solving this problem, solving this optimization problem. So basically, if we write out the Lagrangian for this optimization problem, we essentially get that it's the sum of the deadweight losses, okay, the sum of the deadweight losses minus lambda times the sum of the revenue raised, okay? That basically, that's the function you're optimizing. And that in doing so, you will find that you want to raise, in doing so, if you solve this Lagrangian, you will find that you want to essentially set the marginal deadweight loss of taxing any good I over the marginal revenue you raise from taxing any good I equal to a constant lambda. So let's talk a few minutes about what this formula means. You want that the marginal deadweight loss of, so it's I goods in society. You want to set an individual tax rate on each of the I goods. Each of the I tax rates you set such that the marginal deadweight loss over the marginal revenue equals a constant. Let's ignore what the constant is for a second, just to say that's a constant. Why do you want these things to equal a constant? Well, essentially, what Ramsey's formula does is trade off the two elements of the deadweight loss formula. On the one hand, the deadweight loss formula says you want to tax inelastic goods more. You want to tax inelastic goods more because inelastic goods have a lower efficiency cost. Okay, so that is why basically if the marginal deadweight loss is higher, so basically you want to tax inelastic, you're going to want to tax inelastic goods. So basically on the other hand, so that's one factor. On the other hand, you don't want to put all the tax on one good because then you run into the tau squared problem. So essentially, the trade-off that Ramsey's trying to capture in this formula is the trade-off between, on the one hand, trying to hit inelastic goods, on the other hand, trying to spread taxes so you don't get hurt too much by the tau squared effect. Okay, so if you make a number of simplifying assumptions, we show in the appendix you can rewrite this formula. You can take this, make some simplifying assumptions, and rewrite the Ramsey formula in the following form. The optimal tax on good I is simply minus 1 over the elasticity of demand of good I times lambda. But this is sort of the simplistic form of the Ramsey formula. The optimal tax of good I is minus 1 over the elasticity of demand for good I times lambda. So the idea is the following. The tax is higher, is lower, the higher is the elasticity of demand, because you want to tax inelastic goods, not elastic goods. But it's not simply lexicographically tax the fuck out of the most inelastic good and move your way down the list. It's saying there's a balancing act. Okay, you use this sort of represents a balancing act. You want to tax inelastic goods more, but you really ultimately want to tax all goods, unless some goods are perfectly elastic. You might not want to tax them. And essentially, this is trading off two factors: the elasticity factor, which is taxing inelastic goods more, and the broad base factor, which is trying to spread taxation across multiple goods. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, what's that demand reply?
Oh, this is well. In this case, this is. I'm assuming this example that the elastic supply is 1.
Oh, okay.
Is that right? Yeah, I think the math there for this assumes. No, elastic supply is infinity. I'm sorry, is infinite. This is the optimization with elastic supply, perfectly elastic supply. That's what you get. Okay, so basically, what that says, and then essentially. So that's point 1. Point 1 is you want to set commodity taxations across goods to balance these two considerations. Then there's a question of why does this equal lambda? What's the role of lambda here? Well, lambda is just a shifter. Lambda tells you how much the government needs money. It's the Lagrange constraint. Lambda is telling you how much the government needs the next dollar. If the government needs the next dollar a lot, you want high taxes. If the government needs the next dollar not so much, you want low taxes. But it's just a shifter. Essentially, you set the taxes across all goods according to this proportion. Then you shift the entire thing up or down depending on what lambda is. Okay? So you essentially say for any given amount of money the government needs to raise, we'll tell you the proportions across which to tax goods. Okay? And then the level of the tax we pin down by how much money the government needs to raise. And that's how Ramsey says to set taxes. Okay? Questions about that? Somebody tell me, so Ramsey is an efficiency formula. It says the most efficient way to set taxes is this. What's the equity implications of the Ramsey model? What's the equity implications of this formula? What are the implications of this for rich and poor people? I haven't said anything about income, yet you can still say something about the implications across different types of people based on what you know about consumption patterns and about goods. Think about what rich people consume, what poor people consume. Yeah.
Consume a higher proportion inelastic.
Yeah, exactly. A higher share of poor, you all knew this. Come on, I don't bite. You can answer these questions. Okay. A higher proportion of the poor's consumption will be inelastic goods. Okay, food, housing. A higher proportion of the rich person's bundle will be elastic goods, luxuries, etc. Okay. As a result, the Ramsey formula says tax the stuff that poor people consume the most, which is not very pleasant, but that's the most efficient thing to do. The most efficient thing to do. Now, once again, you don't want to tax only things poor people consume. You want to spread it because of the tau squared rule. But it's important to recognize this has fairly nasty equity implications. Now, it is easy to offset those. which you simply write down a Ramsey model where each good has a social welfare weight that's associated with income distribution of people that consume it. So you say each good is not just parameterized by an elasticity, by an elasticity and a welfare weight. And then you basically include that welfare weight as well in this formula. So you'd say, sure, I want to tax inelastic goods more. On the other hand, if poor people consume them, I want to tax them less, and then you put that into your formula. So you just sort of have to enrich your formula to allow for equity. The key point is absent equity, this says hammer the stuff poor people consume. With equity, it wouldn't say that quite as strongly because equity considerations would go the other way. Then you have a typical social welfare function trading off the equity and efficiency implications. Okay? So let's actually apply this to one of a really interesting example. I like the example because it's a real world application of this somewhat abstract theory, which is basically the Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton at Princeton was actually asked by the nation of Pakistan to help them design their commodity price system. And in particular, somebody mentioned this kind of last time, it's in developing countries, they don't just tax goods, they also subsidize goods. And the key point is that subsidies also cause deadweight loss. Starting from the optimum point of consumption, anything government does to intervene is going to cause deadweight loss. So a tax causes deadweight loss and a subsidy causes deadweight loss. And he was asked by the nation of Pakistan to help the country set its tax and subsidy policy on commodities. And he brought these tools of theory to do it. So let's talk about what he did. So what he did is he said that he basically went to Pakistan and looked at the existing system of what they had. So if you have table 20-1, you guys have that, the table with subsidies and price elasticities and stuff. Okay, so in table 20-1, the first column shows the existing system in Pakistan when he arrived. In Pakistan, there was a 40% subsidy to wheat, a 40% subsidy to rice, and a 5% tax on oil and fat. Okay, that was the existing system. Not budget neutral, they were losing money overall, but the point is, that's just a lambda issue. The point is this gave the relative subsidies and taxes they had. What Deaton did is he then went in and measured the price elasticity of demand for each of these goods. So what he brought to the table was he collected data and measured the price elasticity of demand. And what he found was that wheat was fairly inelastically consumed, but rice and oil and fat were fairly elastically consumed. Okay, that's the second column of the table. So he then said, given that, what does that suggest about the optimal mix of tax and subsidies in this population? So he went and drew graphs like figure 20-8. Figure 20-8 shows the existing system of subsidies and taxes in Pakistan. So for example, in panel A, you have wheat. In panel B, you have rice. Both are subsidized by 40%. But you'll note that the deadweight loss from subsidizing rice is much larger. Why? Because the demand is more elastic. So he showed there's a much larger deadweight loss from subsidizing rice. Likewise, there is a deadweight loss from taxing oil and fat. And that deadweight loss comes, even though the tax on oil and fat's quite low, you still get a non-trivial deadweight loss because it's fairly elastically demanded. So he showed these calculations. And they said, what should we do? And we do. And he said, well, here, the answer is kind of easy. Because on the one hand, you're inefficiently taxing one good to inefficiently subsidize other goods. So an easy answer is lower the taxes and lower the subsidies. You lower taxes, you raise less money. You raise less money, that's less money to pay out subsidies, and efficiency goes up. So if you lower the taxes on oil, okay, and you reduce the subsidies to wheat and rice, overall efficiency goes up. You're causing two offsetting inefficiencies, two additive inefficiencies. You can get rid of both of them by just shrinking your tax and subsidy system. But he said the welfare gain will be much larger if you shrink the subsidies that go to rice than if you shrink the ones that go to wheat. So he suggested you should reduce the tax on oil, but you should use that primarily to reduce the subsidies to rice, because that's very elastically demanded. But then he noticed that he also said, but there's also distributional considerations, which is, it turns out there's also distributional considerations because wheat is very heavily consumed by low-income people, and rice is fairly evenly consumed, and fats and oils are consumed more by high-income people. So the poorest focus on wheat, at least in Pakistan. The poorest eating the most wheat. Rice is pretty much everyone, and oil and fat is the higher income people. So what does that say? Well, that says, well, maybe on equity considerations, maybe you don't quite want to reduce the tax on oils and fats as much as you thought, because you're getting some rich people with that tax. But in some sense, it suggests that even further, you should not be reducing the subsidy on wheat, because it's both inelastically demanded and consumed by the poorest people. So really, the main thing is, if the government wants to readjust its policy, it can shrink taxes, but it should really, in some sense, keep the subsidy in place. If it wants to keep subsidies, it should keep the subsidies in place for wheat and shrink them for rice, both because rice is more elastically demanded than wheat, and because it's more higher income people who consume rice than wheat. And that's sort of a complicated and long example, but it's pretty awesome because it took this, it's just like this abstract theory. He literally went to the data, measured elasticity, and told the government what to do, and they did it. That's pretty cool. Okay, so this stuff can be applied in really interesting ways to make policy. Okay, questions about that? All right, so that's the basics of, yeah, go ahead. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be a great thing to study and see, because when Deaton did this is in the 70s. Empirical work was in a very different place in the 1970s. These elasticities, we want to estimate an elasticity, as we talk about in chapter 3. I can't just regress the quantity of X and the price of X because they're both determined in the same joint system. Well, in the 1970s, we'd never really get the answer for that. So Deaton had some fancy way of solving the problem that didn't really solve it. Now we'd use shocks to the price. We'd use more quasi-experimental effects or run real experiments to get at that. So the answer could be quite different than what he found in his work. It'd be interesting to follow up. Other questions? Yeah. How well-being is calculated here? So basically, well-being is calculated. Essentially, you could think about a measure. Essentially, in developing countries, typically we don't have income measures, so to really be total consumption. And so essentially, the idea is that when we say poor people are the ones that consume wheat, the sort of people with lowest total consumption, the people who consume the wheat, would be the way to think about it, because income's hard to measure in this context. Okay, so speaking of income, Ramsey's all well and good, but we don't tax commodities in the modern world. We tax income. So how do we take these principles to thinking about optimal income taxation? Okay, most of the US federal revenue is raised by income taxation. How do we set that? Well, once again, we're going to think about a similar goal, but now we think about income taxation. Distributional consequences have to be front and center. It says this with commodity taxation, so the distributional consequences are kind of implicit. You're taxing goods, and some goods happen to be consumed by poor or rich people. With income taxation, you're literally going after poor or rich people. So basically, equity, you really have to. So in some sense, if you think about optimal income taxation, it's really front and center about balancing the equity and efficiency implications. So let's start with a simple example. Imagine the following conditions are true. One is you have identical individuals. You have identical individuals. Everybody's got the same utility function. Two is that utility function features diminishing marginal utility. I don't need to tell you the exact functional form. It just has a standard 1401 diminishing marginal utility. Three is society has a utilitarian social welfare function. If you remember from chapter 2, a utilitarian social welfare function is just social welfare is the sum of individual utilities. So social welfare is utility person 1 plus person 2 plus everyone in society. So literally we just measure everyone in America's utility all up to 350 million people. We add them up and that's social welfare. And then finally, we're going to assume that there is the total amount of income in society is fixed. Y bar, which is the total amount of income, is fixed. It can shift around in who gets rich and who gets poor, but we've already decided how much stuff's going to be produced in society. It's just a question of who's going to produce it. Under those conditions, what is the optimal tax system? Under those conditions, what is the optimal income tax system? Yeah. That's condition 4. Total income fixed. No law. Yeah. 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 Since there's no efficiency implications of taxation in this model because income's fixed. So it's just an equity model. Remember, with a social welfare function that's utilitarian, that says that you're going to max the sum of everyone's utility. Well, that's going to be true when everyone's marginal utility is equal. That's the point at which social welfare is maximized. Whatever's marginal utility is equal when we all have the same income. So under these conditions, which except for the last one don't sound crazy, we would want a completely equal distribution of income. That's we want 100% tax rate. You'd literally want to say the government collects all the money and then redistributes it such that everyone has an equal amount. So this is important because it highlights the equity efficiency trade-off. It's always sort of mind-blowing. The utilitarian social welfare function is not a left-wing social welfare function. Just simply saying everyone should be weighted equally. That's not particularly left-wing at all. And yet, it delivers this incredibly radical redistributive outcome unless there's an effect on incomes of taxation. Okay? So that's why understanding the efficiency implications of taxation are so important. Because absent them, we should just simply have a fully equal society with 100% tax rates. 100% marginal tax rates. Okay? But in reality, of course, that's not true. Condition 4 doesn't hold. And that leads to the equity efficiency trade-off and the birth of what we call supply-side economics. Supply-side economics was essentially the movement to recognize that government policy is constrained by what we study in economics, by the responses of individual factors to taxation. Okay? So think about the tax on income. The revenues raised by a tax on income are the tax rate you impose on income times the total amount of income that's taxed. Okay? That's your revenues that are raised. What that means is that the differential and the total amount of incomes that are taxed, however, are a function of TAW. Total amount of income that's taxed is a function of TAW. That's the difference. Condition 4 doesn't hold. Total amount of income that's taxed is a function of TAW. That means if you differentiate this with respect to taxes, you get Y plus TAW times dy dTAW. Okay. In other words, the amount of money that you get from increasing taxes is basically, if there's no behavior response to income, then we just know how much we raise. But if there's a behavior response to income, this term is going to be negative. It's going to offset it. There will be a supply side offset. Basically, by raising the tax rate, you shrink the tax base. And that offsets the revenues you get from that tax. And that is the equity efficiency trade-off inherent in taxation, that by raising the rate, you lower the base. And this was most famously sort of graphically illustrated by what's called the Laffer curve. So the story goes that in late 1970s, Arthur Laffer, who was a famous pseudo-economist, was talking to some future members of the Reagan administration. They were talking about taxation. He drew the following graph, figure 20-9, on a napkin. And he said, look, on the x-axis is the tax rate, on the y-axis is tax revenues. It is transparently true that at a 0 tax rate, you raise no revenues. It is also, he argued, transparently true that a 100% tax rate, you raise no revenues. Why? Because a 100% tax rate, no one would work. If literally everything you earned simply got taken from you, and leisure is a normal good, no one would work. We also know that tax rates in between 0 and 100, some revenues raised. Therefore, we must have a curve of the form of figure 20-9. It doesn't have to be this beautiful hyperbola or whatever. But the point is that essentially, we know if nobody works at 100% tax rate, nobody works 0% tax rate, then it must be true that there are tax increases which are revenue reducing. Definitionally, there must be what he called a right side and a wrong side of the revenue function. The right side, which is ironically the left side, is the part where by raising revenues, by raising taxes, you raise revenues. That's the part where this effect is larger than this effect. On net, DR, that's revenues. This is DR, DTA. Okay, DR, DTA is greater than 0 on the left-hand side or the correct side of this diagram. But DR, DTA is less than 0 on the other side. That there becomes a point where tax rates get so high that raising them actually lowers revenue. And Laffer used this to argue the Reagan administration had cut tax rates dramatically, which they did. And the justification for cutting tax rates in the early 1980s, remember when Ronald Reagan was elected, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 70%, which is pretty high. Okay. So he argued that, look, that was too high and that we could actually raise revenues by cutting tax rates. Yeah.
Did 70% meant they actually paid 70%, or was it like loopholes and stuff?
That was the marginal rate, but there was loopholes. But there's loopholes today. That was the top marginal rate for some with no loopholes.
Okay.
Paul Samuelson famously testified. Paul Samuelson wrote his textbook when the marginal tax rate was 90%. And he testified in Congress, said, look, if anyone actually paid 90%, no one would do anything. You know, he sort of made this Laffer argument, said nobody really pays 90%. But basically, technically, it was 70%. And then some people did pay 70%. And basically, this was the argument that was used to cut that rate. Now, this argument is absolutely true. What is unclear is where the peak is. Laffer argued 70% was on the wrong side, but that was based on nothing. There's no argument. The wrong side might not start till your tax rate's 95%. We don't know ex ante where the peak is. What we do know is there clearly is a correct side and a wrong side of the Laffer curve. Okay? Based on this, what this says is you want to, the optimal income tax rate system is one where you set income tax rates across groups. I is now going to be income groups. You say your income tax rate across income groups such that the marginal utility for group I over the marginal revenue raised from group I equals a constant lambda, which is your revenue need. So it's a new kind of Ramsey formula. The marginal utility each group has from the next dollar over the marginal revenue raised from the next dollar should be set equal to a constant. Okay. Remember, marginal utility is a negative function of income. So when you tax a group more, you raise their marginal utility. Okay. So a poor group has a high marginal utility. A rich group has a low marginal utility. Marginal revenue is how much money you raise from incremental increase in their taxes. So if you think about a poor person, they have a high numerator because they have a high marginal utility of income and a low denominator because you don't get a lot of money from taxing them. If you raise the tax rate by 10%, you don't raise much on them. Okay. If you think about a rich person, they have a low numerator and a high denominator. So a rich person is a much lower value. So you want to tax them more. You want to essentially be taxing rich people more than poor people. But once again, this is trading off. This is not saying just tax the hell out of the richest guy. This is saying trade off the efficiency and equity. Okay, to get, and the way you want to trade them off sets relative tax rates across income, and the LAM just tells you what the level should be. Okay. So basically, this tells you the trade-off between the equity gains of taxing the rich and the efficiency loss of taxing the rich. So a good way to see this is an example. So let's go to figure 20-10. Okay. Imagine a world where the government wants to introduce an income tax. Okay. And you have two lines here for Dr. L and Dr. H. Okay, Dr. H, these lines represent the ratio of marginal utility to marginal revenue. That's these lines represent. And the line for Dr. H, as I said, is lower because Dr. H is richer. So they have a lower marginal utility of income. Okay, so that line is lower for them. Okay, so they have basically they have a lower numerator and a higher denominator. So that line's lower for them. Okay, but as we tax each person more, the line slopes up. Why does it slope up? Because if I tax you more, two things. If I tax you more, your marginal utility of income rises. Your MR doesn't change, but I tax you more, your marginal utility of income rises. So for both groups, it's an upward sloping line. It's just the rich are below the poor. Okay, so the rich are below the poor. They have a lower ratio than the poor, but they both have upward sloping lines. So what that says is you find some point at which you want to raise revenues. Okay, you find some point you want to raise revenues. Let's call it lambda, and you say, well, that determines the y-intercept. That determines how much I want to raise in total. Then where that lambda line hits each line determines the tax rates I want to set in each group. So I want to end up setting a much higher tax rate on the rich than the poor, because for any lambda, you can hit them with a lot more taxes. Okay, and this is an illustration of how I think about optimal income taxes. An illustration of optimal income taxes, which is basically you set the income tax to basically hit the rich more, but not infinitely more. You're not going, 80% the rich and not on the poor. That would be way higher up the green curve, and that would be inefficient. So just like you don't want to just put all your tax on the most inelastic good, you don't want to put all your tax on the very richest guy. You want to spread them to reflect the trade-off between equity and efficiency. Okay? Questions about that? All right. So that is how we do optimal income taxation. Now, let's come to another topic, which is the topic of tax benefit linkages. Remember, I mentioned two lectures ago, maybe last lecture, I forget, maybe last lecture, last lecture. I mentioned that we are ignoring what was done with the revenues. We're saying we're going to look at the equity and efficiency implication of tax and forget what's done with the revenues. But in reality, we can't do that. In reality, what's done with the revenues can come back and determine the equity efficiency of taxation. And this was emphasized by Larry Summers in a very famous article in 1989, where he emphasized the role of tax benefit linkages in labor taxation and how it could offset the perceived inefficiencies of taxing workers to finance social insurance benefits. So for example, let's go to figure 20-11. Let's imagine you have a labor market that's initially in equilibrium at point A. That's where supply equals demand. Okay, supply equals demand at point A. Now, imagine that you want to finance a new benefit for workers. You want to finance a workers' comp program. You want to tax employers to finance a workers' comp program. So you're going to say to employers, hey, we're levying a new tax on you to finance a workers' comp program. Well, the way before this article, I would have answered the question on a test of how this can affect things, I would have drawn figure A. I would have said, well, you're taxing workers by an amount tau that is going to shift down the demand for labor and create the deadweight loss ABC. Summers pointed out that was wrong, because Summers said, what are you doing with the money? With the money, you are giving workers a benefit. Therefore, you're increasing the return to work. Workers used to essentially trade off the value of leisure against the wage plus the risk of having to lose that wage if they got hurt. Now, that risk is covered. So now workers are more happy to work. You're giving them something that's tied to work. And that shifts out the supply curve. Workers are more willing to work because now work comes with an extra benefit, which is worker comp benefits. Work comes with extra benefit, which is workers comp benefits. Yeah.
Will be more willing to work relative to if you took it and give it somewhere else.
Or relative to a world with no workers' comp taxation. Just think about the worker supply decision. Relative to any world, if I give you workers, forget where the money's coming from. It could come manna from heaven. If I give you a benefit, like you now makes work more attractive. Before, I was about going to work, and I said, well, my supply curve essentially reflects my taste for leisure against the wage curve, plus the fact I might get hurt in the job. Now, if I get hurt in the job, I get compensated, so I'm more willing to go to work. Before, I wasn't sure I wanted to go to work. I might get hurt and lose my salary. Now, if I go to work, I get compensated. If I get hurt, I don't mind as much. I'll go to work. So it shifts the supply curve out. That was Summers' insight. What does that do? If it shifts the supply curve out, that means that the new labor market equilibrium is not at point B, but at point E in the second panel. That is, the amount of labor doesn't fall from L1 to L2. It falls from L1 to L3. And the deadweight loss is reduced. Now, deadweight loss triangle is really funky here, okay? Because that shift out in supply, the deadweight loss is always drawn with respect to social marginal benefit and cost curves. Okay, the curves we're shifting here are private marginal benefit and cost. We care about the social marginal benefit and cost. So deadweight loss triangles in the same place it was before. It doesn't move. Okay, but it's now smaller because there's less displacement of labor. Here's an easier way to think about it. Okay, the easy way to think about it is, remember, deadweight loss is about quantities. Deadweight loss is proportional to how much quantities are distorted. Taxes are more inefficient if quantities are distorted more. If workers value the benefits, quantities are distorted less, and therefore there's less deadweight loss. Indeed, imagine an extreme case, which is figure 2012. Imagine we put in a program that costs an employer a certain amount of taxes. And let's imagine workers value that benefit. Imagine workers are homogeneous. And workers value that benefit at exactly that amount. Well, in that case, there's no deadweight loss from this program. Because the reduction demand from employers having to pay for it is the same as the increase in supply that workers value, by which workers value it. In other words, literally what happens in figure 2012 is it's just a shift in compensation. Firms used to pay you W1. Now they pay you W2 plus the cost of workers' comp. And since W1 equals W2 plus the cost of workers' comp, the employer's indifferent and the worker's indifferent. So nothing's changed. This is what we call the case of sort of full shifting to wages. If workers value what employers are giving them at the full cost, there'll be no deadweight loss. You just change the nature of compensation. So it'll shift pay from all cash to cash plus benefits. But employers won't care because they just care about the money they're sending out at the end of the day. Workers don't care because they're happy to get the dollar in cash or the dollar in workers' comp. So you end up with no deadweight loss, just a shift in the nature of compensation. So Summers' argument was very timely because Summers wrote this article because at that time, many people, including candidate Bill Clinton, or well, this was before candidate Bill Clinton, but many people in this this is early in the air, was this idea of employer mandated health insurance. This is pre-individual mandates. Remember I said the individual mandate was a response to what Clinton had proposed. Clinton proposed employer mandates. And Summers' article was written in some sense as defense. People said you can't mandate employers to provide insurance, they'll fire all their workers. They won't be able to afford it. You're basically taxing employers. And Summers' point was, no, that's not true. You're not just taxing employers, you're also providing benefit to employees. Now an offsetting effect. Indeed, Summers argued, it was possible that there would be no deadweight loss at all from something like employer required taxation. Okay, questions about that? Now, if you're a University of Chicago economist and you saw figure 2012, why would you call bullshit? Why would you say, well, figure 2012 obviously possibly cannot exist? Why? Why could it not be the government would impose this and create zero deadweight loss? Yeah. No, but in this case, this is a theoretical case, no efficiency losses. But why in reality would that case not exist? What Chicago economists say. Yeah.
People don't actually ever substitute benefits.
No, people do. People do substitute benefits. But go further with that. What is implying? Yeah. Well, there's administration costs, but imagine that's in there. Imagine that's in there. Imagine the total cost of the administration cost. Yeah. People might not, but that's not a Chicago position. That's a Cambridge position. Chicago believes everyone's super rational. Yeah.
Then like businesses provide the same program.
Yeah. Why don't businesses do it already? This is the $10 lying on the sidewalk argument. If it's true, people value it at its cost. Why do people go to their employers and say, hey, pay me less and give me workers' comp? Employers say, sure, I don't care. Okay. So the Chicago argument is this is a stupid graph because it can't exist. You can't have a situation where the government could jointly make employers and employees better off, because employees could jointly be made better off. They would have negotiated that on their own. Now, Larry Summers is not a dumb guy. He realized that argument, and he said that wasn't true because it misses a key feature that we learned about in chapter 12, which is the problem of adverse selection, which is, let's say that the average employee, let's say it's the early 1980s, and employers deciding whether to add coverage for AIDS to their health insurance policies, the example he used because it was very timely, was writing the article. Okay. And let's say that the average person in America, let's say on average, it would cost like 5 cents for every person to add AIDS coverage to our insurance package. So, because AIDS incidence is so small, it costs 5 cents on average, and we'd all happily pay 5 cents on the small risk we or someone in our family might get AIDS. Would you want to be the first employer to run out there and market, say, hey, I'm the employer that offers AIDS coverage? No, because you're worried that all the employees who are sexually engaging in sexually risky behavior in this pre-AIDS treatment era would come work for you. So even if on average your employee is willing to pay for it, you don't want to be the employer that offers it because you get adversely selected against. So Summers' argument is it's not at all implausible that you get a situation like figure 2012. Workers want the benefit, employers would, but employers are afraid to provide it because they don't want to get selected against. And so that was his counter. That was his counter to that. So that was the really sort of power of his argument. Questions about that? Now, the problem with his argument is that he did not highlight a key limitation. In particular, a key limitation of how people were going to apply his article, which is, remember, the argument was what we're going to do. Basically, the Clinton plan was we're going to mandate employers provide health insurance to their workers. And then for people who don't work, we'll also have a government plan, you know, because you got to cover people who don't work. So mandate employer insurance people who work, well, a government plan people who don't work. Why does that destroy the Summers argument? Why is the Clinton plan inconsistent with the Summers argument? The Clinton plan is a mandated employer. All employers must cover all their employees with health insurance, and for those who don't work, we'll have a a government plan. Yeah.
Well, then there's no benefit to working.
Yeah. Really, the key thing, Summers' article was called The Simple Economics of Mandated Benefits. It shouldn't have been called that. It should have been called The Simple Economics of Tax Benefit Linkages. The reason he gets this effect is because the benefit's limited to workers. If non-workers can get it, there's no shift in the supply curve. There's no reason to go to work to get it. You can get it not working too. So there's no shift in the supply curve. So really the key, the crux of his argument really didn't apply to things like employer-provided health insurance, where there's lots of non-employer options. It does apply to things like workers' comp, where there's no comparable non-work version. Workers' comp, it makes a lot of sense, this argument. And indeed, the very first article I ever wrote with the late economist Alan Kruger was exactly investigating this for workers' comp, where we looked at what happened to wages when workers' compensation costs went up. And we found that, roughly speaking, wages went down about 1-for-1 with every dollar increase in workers' comp costs. That workers' comp appeared to be approximately fully shifted to the wages of employees, and there wasn't an effect on employment. What's kind of nice about this empirical work is there's really two predictions, right? If figure 2012 is right, there's two predictions. One is wages should fall by the cost of the program, administrative costs included. And two is employment shouldn't change. And we found both those things to be true for workers' comp. So that suggested that, in fact, this was a realistic case. Okay. But then there's a third question, which this raises, which is, what if the benefits don't go equally to all workers in the firm, which almost certainly they never do. So health insurance is not worth the same thing to everyone in the firm. Workers' comp is not worth the same thing to everyone in the firm. How does that mess up the model? Okay. In particular, a lot of people want to use this model to advocate for maternity leave, paid maternity leave. The critical argument against paid maternity leave is that it will cause employers to not want to hire women because women of childbearing age, because they're worried that they will have to then pay for these people not be at work. So if you look at the political arguments around paid maternity leave, it's going to destroy job opportunities for women of childbearing age. And so the question is that true? Or could employers actually literally do a group specific wage shift? Could employers literally pay women less than men if you mandated a benefit for women, not for men? And that was what I investigated in my thesis in graduate school, was exactly this question in different context, which was that a number of states and the subsequent US government changed the way pregnancy was treated by health insurance. So the way pregnancy, when I was born, back in the dinosaur ages, the way health insurance treated pregnancy was if you got hit by a car or broke your arm or whatever, they paid the hospital bill. If you got pregnant, they just sent you a check for $200 and said good luck. Because they said pregnancy isn't an accident, it's a choice. So basically, we're just going to not treat it as an insurable event. That was viewed as discriminatory, rightly. And a number of states starting in the 1970s, and eventually the federal government in 1978, outlawed discrimination against pregnancy in insurance. They said you have to cover pregnancy the same way you cover all other medical conditions. What that did was it massively increased the cost of increasing women of childbearing age, because basically for young, healthy people, medical care is cheap. Basically, people of 40 don't cost a lot, except for pregnancy. And so suddenly there was a very large proportional increase in the cost of increasing women of childbearing age and their husbands, who covered them and their families, relative to single men, for example, or older women. So that set up a nice quasi-experiment. Was able to look at what happened. This is sort of one of the first applications of difference and difference and difference design. I was able to look at what happened to women relative to men in states that passed these laws versus didn't, after versus before the laws were passed. So sort of a chapter 3 kind of classic chapter 3 kind of analysis. And what I found was good news and bad news. Well, I found something that's both good news and bad news. What I found was there was full shifting to wages. That basically women's employment didn't suffer, but their wages did. That the amount by which employers had to pay women childbearing age more seems to be reflected in their wages and not in their employment. Now, why is that good news and bad news? Well, the good news is it means that there wasn't an efficiency cost to this pregnancy provision. They were able to give women insurance for pregnancy without causing employers to want to fire women. The bad news is that some people thought, the bad news is this wasn't redistributive towards women at all. The bad news, if the goal was to help women, you didn't help women necessarily. You just shifted the way they were paid. Now, maybe they valued it more than it costs. You might have helped them. But let's say they valued as much as it costs. Then all you're doing, you were basically taxing women to help women. You weren't actually redistributing towards women. So in some sense, it depends on your goal of your policy. If your goal is you feel like women need more benefits in the labor market, this doesn't help. If your goal is there's an inefficiency of driven insurance that discriminates against women, this did help. It fixed that. So really, in some sense, how you feel about these policies depends on what your goal is. And there's been subsequently a large literature which has looked at both overall shifting to wages and group-specific shifting to wages. And generally, it's quite interesting what the literature finds, which is it finds that when you mandate benefits like workers' comp or health insurance, they seem to be largely shifted to wages. But when you put in a payroll tax that finances a program like Social Security or UI, even though it should operate the same way, it's a tax to a work-linked benefit, the shifting is much less than complete. So it's not quite clear what's going on. So my psychology of people thinking about a mandate versus a payroll tax is not clear. But there seems to be fairly full shifting of mandated benefits and more limited shifting of benefits that are paid for by a payroll tax. Okay, questions about that? Now this, yeah, go ahead.
When benefits are shifting less than
Then there'd be an employment loss. That'd be like figure 2011B, where there's some shifting, but not fully. So essentially, once again, in some sense, the effect on wages is isomorphic to the effect on employment, right? If worker wages don't fall by the full cost, employment's going to fall. But if worker wages fall by the full cost, employment won't fall. And that's sort of the way to think about it.
so it's inefficient.
So it's inefficient. Now, you could argue that that inefficiency is offset by other social benefits to, for instance, kids might be healthier, pregnancies covered. So this is in a vacuum of otherwise markets are perfect. Okay. But yeah, in an otherwise perfect market, that would be still inefficient. Okay. This raised a number of other interesting issues. Like, for example, this is a cost of the minimum wage. Remember, we talked about the inability to decide if the market is relevant once the minimum wage. Well, if you take this analysis and put in minimum wage, you can't fully shift to workers. So that's an extra inefficiency potentially of the minimum wage. Talk about the minimum wage of costing jobs. This may be an incremental way the minimum wage costs jobs. There's also the interesting issue of how do employers shift differentially to different groups? Do they literally, you can't literally go to women and say, I'm paying you less because you might get pregnant. That's not allowed. Is it through lower promotions? My paper was in the 70s in a high inflation arena was it just slower raises? We don't know. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts about this? Yeah.
Are there possibilities that equal returns on
Men and women.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, most countries now do, and men don't take it. I mean, basically, in most countries, there's sort of equal entitlement by gender. They don't have gender-specific entitlements. MIT has that too in their parent leave. But the rule is the parent that's primarily taking care of the kid takes the leave. And generally, that's women. I mean, one of the fascinating things in our society is even as the labor force behavior as women has sort of normalized and become pretty much comparable to men, certainly among educated women, pretty much comparable to men. I mean, basically, employment rate of educated women is not that different pre-child. Wages are not enormously different pre-child. When women have kids, they are much more likely to stay home, and their wages suffer much more than their husbands. There's even a large literature on this. It's called the child penalty literature. The child penalty literature, which there's a long-standing finding that women earn less than men. But in fact, what this literature shows is that's really women with kids learn less than men once they have kids. Women without kids don't necessarily earn that much less than men. It's once women have kids, they really suffer in the labor market, which is amazing in a world where basically female labor force participation, I mean, the opportunities are good for both genders, certainly well-educated both genders, okay? Yet we have a world where women suffer much more than men from having children. And the question is, what's going on with that? Why is it that we still have a society where there's still this inherent bias towards women doing the child rearing, women leaving the labor force to raise the kid, women having more responsibility for home chores, things like that? And it's a fascinating question that people are still working on. Okay, other questions? All right, let's stop for Thanksgiving. No class on Wednesday. You guys get an early start on your trip. Well, problem set's is due next Friday. We handed the problem set out, right, last Friday. Problem set is due next Friday. So no class on Wednesday. We'll come back next Monday and we'll talk about taxes on labor supply.